Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Ariely, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Today, we're focusing on how atheists find solace and honor their deceased loved ones in a world where many grieving processes are often intertwined with religious beliefs. We're joined by Rebecca Hensler, the founder of Grief Beyond Belief, a support network for individuals who are grieving without a belief in a higher power or afterlife. Rebecca has had her own profound journey of loss and has since dedicated herself to helping others find community and support in times of grief. Welcome, Rebecca, to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Could you start off by sharing with us a little bit about your personal journey and what led you to create Grief Beyond Belief?
Like all stories about grief beyond belief, it starts with Jude. When I was around 40, uh, having been told I could never have a baby without thousands of dollars in fertility care, I actually did manage to get pregnant. And Um, very soon after I found out I was pregnant, I was told that my son was going to be born with a serious birth defect, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, which basically means a hole in the muscle that holds the chest organs in the chest and the abdominal organs in the abdomen while the fetus is developing. Um, and as a result of that birth defect, he was born with, serious problems with his heart and very undersized lungs. And the doctors, when I was pregnant, said he had a 1 in 10 chance of making it. I, thanks to the union, have very good health care. So my wife and I were like, we are going to give him his best chance possible. And so he was very sick when he was born. He spent his entire life in the NICU. Um, he was an amazing little baby. He was really smart and really beautiful. Like I kept staring at him thinking, how did I make anything this beautiful? Um, and really curious. He was just this awesome little guy. And we spent all of the summer of 2009 in and out of the hospital, seeing him every day. My mom came and saw him every day. He was a really loved little baby. And, he fought really hard. Um, and he got amazing care from the nurses. But he died when he was 90 days old. Um, and you know, and I went into a period of really deep mourning, as one does. And a few months into it, on a particular night, I was really struggling. I discovered that there was this thing, online grief support. There were Facebook groups. And that was super helpful because it meant that when I was a mess and couldn't stop crying in the middle of the night, there were other people to talk to, specifically other people who had lost their child, because I was participating in Compassionate Friends, which you may know is specifically for people who have lost a child. And so it was really helpful, but it was also very quickly became very alienating because the comfort I was offered didn't help. Um, I would be told, he was in heaven, I would see him again. These ideas that did not hold true to me. And I remember vividly, there was this one time where I had posted about Jude, and a woman who was grieving her adult daughter told me, oh, my daughter's in heaven and she's holding him and taking care of him until you can be with him again. And honestly, I mean, I'm not just an atheist, I'm a bit of a cynic. And I was like, statistically, the odds that your daughter, even if this was all true, statistically, the odds that your daughter would be holding my baby are slim to none. And that kind of thinking, where I would experience this serious cognitive dissonance, that is really hard for non-believers when we grieve and are offered spiritual or religious comforts. So, I started thinking there really ought to be grief support specifically for people who don't have spiritual or religious beliefs. And I spent about a year sort of half thinking about how would I make this happen and half wishing someone else would do it. Because I was not actually in any state to do the work myself yet. But as often happens in my life, when I'm like, someone should do it, I sort of throw up my hands and say, okay, if this is going to happen, it's going to be me. And so I started thinking about what it would look like and really used the model of what Compassionate Friends was doing at the time and started a Facebook page in 2011. And at that time, I had a lot of really great connections with atheist bloggers and podcasters and such. And so, there were a lot of people who'd been writing about this and wishing that something like Grief Beyond Belief existed. And so they were really happy to jump in and promote it. And so while I thought, like, I'll start this and there'll be a few dozen people, and, it'll be me and my little Facebook page. And, you know, I think within the first day, it was 100 people. Within the first week, it was 1,000 people. But more importantly, within the first few days, it was people saying, here is my grief, and other people jumping in and supporting them in ways that actually felt comforting. And that was this incredible sensation to me to watch it and say, oh, this is doing what this is meant to do, and it's not just me offering comfort. This is what it's for, is for people to comfort each other. And so that's how Grief Beyond Belief came about.
Right. And so it's a supportive space. Either as peer support or support from other people who are going through the same grief that everyone goes through when a person passes away. Are there resources or other types of support that are on the actual site itself also?
I think that's really what people tend to use both the original Facebook page and the griefbeyondbelief.org for, is to read, to learn. People who are grief support and other end of life care providers sometimes use the site just because if they themselves are not secular, it helps them to kind of learn. And so I really collected as much of the writing that had been done on the topic as possible. The Facebook group, which is, Facebook has changed its formats over constantly, sometimes fixing things that didn't need fixing. And so it's really the Facebook group, which is closed and people have to apply to be a part of and answer some questions. That's where the peer to peer support happens. And then in addition, I do get asked to go speak on the topic of secular grief. When I go somewhere to speak to an organization, I always not only do a talk, but also do a workshop so that people who are grieving can participate in that. Um, and I've even had the opportunity to talk to end of life professionals about how to appropriately serve the population. And that I would love to do more of. I really want to make myself available, whether it's to universities with programs or conferences, to really share what I've learned with people who are not so familiar with secular grief.
I want to talk about rituals because rituals help us reduce our anxiety by providing our brains with a sense of comfort and predictability. Yet, the majority of our memorial rituals are religious in nature. How can atheists find meaningful ways to honor their deceased loved ones?
Well, I think one thing I have to say is that, one of the tenets of humanism is the idea that because there is no God, we need to do things for each other ourselves. I once heard a student of mine who didn't have a God belief say, "In my family, we make our own miracles." And so I think while it's not exactly a ritual, one thing that non-believers often do in memory of their loved ones is do something, whether it's start a foundation, whether it's be politically involved. I learned a lot about that myself. When I was in my 20s, I was an AIDS activist. And so much of AIDS activism was about taking our grief and turning it into anger and turning it into action. And so that to me is very much a part of, who I've been and who I learned to be when I was younger. Um, but there are also rituals that are, you know, that come from religious backgrounds that have can be participated in a way that doesn't require a faith belief. So lighting a candle, I mean, coming from a Jewish background, the traditional way to memorialize your loved one every year on the anniversary of their death is to light a candle. And I still find that comforting because it's a way of remembering that Jude existed. Um, and when my students, because I work at a school, they'll see the candle, and you don't usually have a candle lit in your room in a classroom. So um, they'll ask, why is there a candle there? And then I'll tell the story of Jude. And it lets me kind of bring him to life in a way. And we do secular people, we have secular memorials. And, you know, the ritual of having a memorial ceremony for someone is meaningful and comforting, regardless of your beliefs. It helps to come together because you're with other people who are sharing the same pain. Um, but I think one thing that's really different is that atheist and humanist memorials are always entirely about the loved one for whom we're grieving. And it's funny because I've even heard from people who are themselves religious that they found it annoying that they go to a memorial, they go to a funeral, and it was more about God and Jesus than about my loved one because the preacher didn't even know my loved one. And so they didn't have anything to say about him. So they just talked about Jesus. And I'm not saying that to criticize because I know that there are, I've been to deeply moving religious funerals and memorials. But I think one of the things that's really special in a secular memorial is that it's really about the person and tends to be almost entirely storytelling. And storytelling is this amazing secular way of both mourning and bringing the person who is gone kind of into the present moment.
Thank you. What we talked about the art site candle. Are there other practices or other things that you do to help you honor Jude?
There are a couple things I do. One is relates to the Grief Beyond Belief community itself. So Jude is It's funny, if there were patron saints in atheism, Jude would be the patron saint of grief beyond belief. Jude is the reason grief beyond belief exists. And so on his birthday every year, I, on social media, post a photograph of him and tell his story. And hundreds of people respond, you know, both respond about him and how beautiful he was, and also how much it's meant to him and how grateful they are to that he existed. And that's super meaningful to me, because when you lose a baby, you know, most people who live 90 days don't have an impact on people outside of their own family. That's the nature of losing a baby, is that the baby's life affects your family, but especially if their life is entirely in the hospital, no one but the nurses and the family really ever get to know them. And so Jude's really unusual in that thousands of people know who he was, even though he died at 3 months. And then we have a private ritual, my wife and I, which is to put a candle on a cupcake. And, we did that in the years that he would have been 1 and 2 and 3, the ages that you light a candle on a cupcake for a little kid. And it's different now, because, you know, he'd have graduated from middle school last June. And sometimes it's really hard that it's still lighting a candle on a cupcake, because, you know, I wish my little boy had grown up to have more grown up celebrations, and that's never going to happen. But we still have the ritual every year.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that how I view grief has changed a lot since I've become an end of life doula. How has your own perception of grief evolved since you started Grief Beyond Belief?
Hmm. Well, I've learned a lot about grief because I've taken time to actually read some of the research and learn more. And, I started out really kind of not knowing all that much, except my own experiences. And so, you know, one thing is I'm just more aware of things like, you know, um, the stages of grief wasn't really meant to be about grief in the first place, and that, even though so many people still will come to grief beyond belief and be like, I'm I'm struggling because I'm not going through these phases, and always someone, and that doesn't have to be me anymore, pops in and is like, actually, that's fine. And so I think one of the things I've really learned is about how many of the things we go through are normal, and are our brain trying to help us get through this really hard time. So people will say, you know, I keep thinking I'm seeing my loved one, and I don't believe in ghosts, but I don't know what to make of this. And so being able to explain, your brain does that because your brain's having a hard time adjusting to a world without your loved one in it. Um, and that's a normal thing. And there are a gazillion normal things our brains do when we're grieving. And so one of the things that's really changed for me is both becoming aware of those myself and learning a little about why they happen, but also realizing how important it is for people to hear. And it was important for me, that's a normal thing to go through, that you're not, experiencing poor mental health if you're having these strange experiences. It's actually that's your healthy brain time trying to take care of you.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate that in our society we don't learn more about grief and mourning, because so many people come to it with a belief that they'll get over it in a year or that they should even get over it. And, when I do grief coaching, many people ask me, what are the stages? Because I want to understand what I'm going to go through. And there are really, as you've said, there really are not stages. It is messy. There's no linear approach. You might be angry, for weeks, be feel different things, and then come back to that, several months later, and just so it's unfortunate that we don't explore it more and don't and we're not open about what it
I
really
wish
is.
that someone had told me that feeling better was not going to be a linear process. Because, I didn't really know what to make of it when, I didn't feel like I needed grief support a month after Jude died. But, a year after Jude died, I was desperately in need of support. I actually sought out an in-person grief support group at the time. And so one of the things I do try and help people understand who are like, why aren't I feeling better? Sometimes I'm like, you're actually going to likely to feel worse for a while, and then you're going to feel better, and then you're going to feel worse again, and just that same thing of normalizing what it's like.
Yeah, definitely. What advice do you have for secular people who are navigating the grief process, particularly because we live in an environment where they're the minority?
I think definitely seeking out other people who are experiencing grief in the same way you are. Um, I think there are some things really worth reading. I mean, Greta Christina's comforting thoughts about death that have nothing to do with God. Um, you know, is I've had many people join Grief Beyond Belief who say they heard about it in that book, but will also say, I found this book actually really helpful because it's specifically like what is comforting that doesn't need God for me to feel better. And so I definitely recommend that book, especially to people who aren't themselves in a place where they might be around other secular people. Um, I also, I do find, you know, Worden's tasks of grief useful as a way to think about grief. Um, that, recognizing that, like I said earlier, like your brain is trying to kind of figure out how to live in a world that does not have your loved one physically in it, and how to maintain that relationship with without believing that that person's in heaven or a ghost or a spirit or whatever, you know, how to still maintain the relationship with your memory of them, and be conscious of how they affected your life and carry that into the future. And then the importance of meaning making. Um, because I think a lot of people, I mean, the thing about grieving within a traditional religious structure is that the meaning of the loss is kind of handed to you on a platter. And as atheists, no one hands us the meaning of of a loss. And so we really have to figure it out for ourselves. And like I was talking about, for me, you know, so much meaning, it felt so meaningless that my little boy came into being and then left so quickly. And so, making there be some kind of meaning made a huge difference for me.
You bring up wardens for tasks, and I really like uh, his theory also, and his because it doesn't talk about getting over grief. It is how can you integrate it into your life, because it's not going away. It's you're it's
Exactly. And in Grief Beyond Belief, we don't talk about getting over it or moving on. We talk about learning to live with grief and helping each other learn to live with grief and how to move forward with grief as part of our life, not to stay in the same place, but not move on and leave it behind.
yeah. How can people that do believe in a higher power, uh, how can they support their secular friends and family members in their grief without imposing their own views on that person?
I think the most important thing is to remember that what you find comforting is not what I find. And that trying to talk someone into believing in an afterlife or some kind of reunification is absolutely not helpful. Who knows? Maybe sometime in the future they will come into that belief. People change, right? I'm not going to say that, your atheist friend is never going to change their mind. But let me tell you, they're not going to change their mind because you're saying, if you only believed in heaven, you'd stop being in pain. Also, that's not true. If that was true, then people who believe in heaven would not suffer, right, when they are grieving. And so we know that people of all beliefs suffer. We know, from Bonanno's research, we know that people of all beliefs, experience a yearning for those that they've lost. Um, but, the fact is, I think one of the worst things is telling someone that they will feel better if they believe something they don't believe, because that's not how belief works. You don't talk yourself into it. And all that does is result in really painful and complicated cognitive dissonance where you're trying to believe two things that don't match.
How have online communities like Grief Beyond Belief evolved in providing support for those that are grieving within the last couple of years, especially since we've had COVID and we see a huge increase in virtual connections?
I mean, COVID, wow, the combination of, you know, I'm a school counselor, so I was sitting at home through all of it and watching the number of people, applying to join our closed support group. It was super painful to see those numbers grow and grow and grow. I think, you know, grief support online, it's one of the best purposes, best, most useful things I've seen come out of social media. Um, it's as a school counselor, you hear so many negative things about social media, and yet I can, easily point to Grief Beyond Belief and say, actually, there's this incredibly positive thing where people connect. And I think one of the things I have to point out about um, online grief support and secular grief support and what makes the combination so important is that, um, as we were talking about before, there are a lot of people who are grieving without belief in parts of the country in which they are extremely isolated. And and often, surrounded by pressure to believe and to have a Christian way of thinking about loss and grief. Um, and so for those people, they're not going to be sitting at a coffee house with a friend and, talking about how you've been through grief without an afterlife belief. They're going to be surrounded by people who are sometimes telling them really terrible things. I mean, I, one of the things that happened once I started, reaching out to people who were non-believers is I learned, how much harm um, people can do through religion sometimes. And I have a close friend who was one of the earliest members of Grief Beyond Belief, um, who left. He was part of the evangelical church. He left the evangelical church, um, and people his both of his two of his teenage sons had died, and people said horrible things to him. He was a former pastor, and people said, like, God took your sons so that they wouldn't see your shame in having left the church. And I mean, things that were really just terrible things to say to any human being. And for someone like that who was surrounded you know by religion, um, to have online grief support that was appropriate to his actual thinking about the world was in many ways life saving. And I do hear that people who say, like, this saved my life.
I believe it. Um, I'd like to talk about the workplace. Now, the workplace, no matter what, well, doesn't do really well with grief and mourning. Um, are there any specific challenges that atheists face when grieving and attending work?
I don't know that it's so much about attending work, but I think sometimes it's about, the people in our workplace might not necessarily be that thoughtful about what is helpful for us. And, often people in your workplace are not the people you've chosen as friends. It's really hard for me to think about workplace grief without thinking about my own experience, where one, you know, like you get 3 days of, bereavement,
Yep.
and that is absolutely absurd. And so, you know, I was back at work with, which ended up being good for me because I had lots of needy little middle schoolers to keep me distracted. But I was back at work very quickly. But I did have a colleague who she thought she was psychic, and she told me she had been talking to my son and he told her why he died. And I mean, the whole thing was absolutely appalling. And so um, I really think that it's just a matter of, if you're in the workplace, it's important to remember, like, you don't necessarily know everything about the people who you work with, and don't assume that they have the same beliefs you do, especially in a place like the Bay Area. Have we are so diverse, and so our beliefs are so diverse. You can't just approach someone the way you would, in your own family, and assume that what you have to offer them is comforting. Um, but
Yeah.
also, I'm just got to say, we really need workplaces, corporations, to understand grief better, and that you cannot expect people to feel it better after 3 days.
Yeah, I know that when I was working in corporate America, if someone had a death in their family, the go-tos were to send out flowers with a card, usually religious in nature, even in the Bay Area. And then there would be a lot of people instant messaging that person on the team, like the team Slack channels, as an example, and you get a lot of praying for you and in all of my training, because we had so much corporate training on diversity and how to respect diversity, none of it ever mentioned secular, the secular viewpoint. What can workplaces, how can workplaces do better in that area in helping everyone um, respect people's views, regardless of if they're religious or if they're secular? Because I think there's a lot of assumptions that people have.
Oh, I think, just a reminder, honestly, when you're passing around that bereavement card, a little reminder, don't forget that not everyone grieves the same way you do, whereas the same beliefs might go a long way. Also, I mean, I'm not saying people shouldn't say I'm praying for you if they know that someone would value that. But the thing about um, a secular message of comfort is that it probably also is comforting someone who is not secular. Um, you know, if I what I can say, is that, I'm thinking of someone with love and compassion, thinking of your family. Um, I've never had a Christian person be offended by me saying, I'm thinking of you with love and compassion rather than you're in my thoughts and prayers.
Rebecca, thank you. It is almost the top of the hour. So I really appreciate your time. You mentioned one book. Are there other resources or any other books that you'd recommend for people who are looking to explore grief from a secular perspective?
Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of writing about it yet, although there are a lot of, blog posts and things like that. Um, if someone is a end of life care provider of any kind, I've actually written a handbook called the Secular Grief Support Handbook, and it's primarily for secular organizations that are already secular and want to know more about providing grief support within their community. But there is a chapter in it that's basically an introduction to secular grief. And so, and if someone writes to me and says, "Hey, I'd be interested in reading that chapter so that I'm better able to, serve my non-believer, my clients who are non-believers, my patients who are non-believers," I'm always happy just to send a PDF of that chapter, um, because it just having that little piece of information, especially if you're already a grief therapist, if you're already providing end of life care, you know a lot about it already. You could just use a little bit of information about what makes serving non-believers different.
Thank you. Lastly, how can our viewers get involved with Grief Beyond Belief or support its mission?
That's a good question. First of all, if you yourself are grieving and do not believe in an afterlife or any kind of deity or any supernatural, please look us up on Facebook, Grief Beyond Belief Private Support Group, and answer the questions that are pushed out to you. Keep an eye on your message requests because sometimes we have a little follow-up question or two. um, and because our goal is to bring people into the community where they can receive support. Um, in terms of people supporting the community, I think, you know, really what's most helpful and what's been hugely helpful has been um, hospital chaplains and hospice chaplains who recommend grief beyond belief to their clients who are non-believers. Uh, that's just amazing to me, especially someone who themselves is religious, being able to to hear and accept that maybe they don't actually know everything that their client might need, and being willing to tell them, look, here's a community that's just for you. That's been just incredible, the number of people who get referred to us through chaplains. And so the biggest way you can help is by, letting, whether it's your friend or your client or your family member, know that grief beyond belief exists.
Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the show, and the work that you're doing with Grief Beyond Belief. Thank you for that. It's truly invaluable. How can viewers get hold of you if they want to?
um, Grief beyond belief at Gmail is the easiest way to reach me directly.
Thank you. And to our viewers, remember in times of loss, you are not alone, and there are communities out there like Grief Beyond Belief ready to support you. If Rebecca's words have resonated with you, please donate to the organization. I'll be placing a link to where you can do that in the description of this video. And if you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you found this video to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.